So I'm going to go ahead. It's noon on my end, so I'm going to get started. Welcome to today's Women Owning Woodland. So today we're talking about identifying and treating invasive species, particularly in the fall. So this is going to really focus on species that we can easily identify right now, and that it's good to treat them in the fall. So quick, kind of our always starting point about Women Owning Woodland. So this is a program just for women woodland owners and enthusiasts who are interested in learning more about the forest and the inhabitants of the forest, and along with other natural resources topics. We organize field days, lunch and learns, and classes. Also a Facebook page if anyone's interested in networking opportunities, and a place that feel free to post questions to that page. Quick upcoming events. So after this lunch and learn, we have two more, September 22nd and the 29th. September 22nd is covering management plans and what's all in them. And then the 29th, Carly Dawson, who is with the National Deer Association, she's going to be our guest speaker that day to talk about deer management and things we can do to improve wildlife on our property, particularly for white-tailed deer. And then I included like just our general natural resources programming. And so not all this comes from extension, some of it comes from the university proper, but on October 2nd, our Horticulture and Agroforestry Research Center up in New Franklin, they host the Missouri Chestnut Roast Festival. So they did it virtually last year. This year they're back to in person. And they have kind of a variety of things and demonstrations that happen there at the research farm, with roasting of chestnuts being one of them. There's usually some live music and tours of the farm. So usually a good time. Another of interest coming out of Kaffner at the university is a Black Walnut Field Day. This is October 7th, and it's at the Mount Vernon, at Southwest Center. So if anyone's interested, it's like 1 to 5, and they're going to go over black walnut production and kind of the commercial side of black walnut production. So pretty interesting as well. And then new to the calendar is we will be holding a woodland steward chainsaw safety class on October 15th. And that's also at the Southwest Center there in Mount Vernon. And this will be all day. It's from 9 to 3. The morning will be a classroom setting where we'll talk about choosing a chainsaw, caring for a chainsaw, safety. We'll talk about properly felling a tree. And then the afternoon will be a demonstration. And then hopefully for the last hour, we will allow participants to try out a chainsaw and actually fell a tree, perhaps. That's our hope. And again, that does have so this last one has a fee of $75. There is some potential for scholarships. So if interested in that, you can contact me. All right, I think that's all of the kind of administrative side of stuff. Today's presentation is about invasive species. So at the end of this, hopefully you'll understand why invasive plants are so successful and be able to identify some of the more common invasive plant species that we find in fall and that do pose a threat to our forests and woodlands. Invasive species this week was actually in the news, not plant species. Well, there was a plant species in the news as well that was of interest, but I'm going to talk about, I have one slide at the end with some insects, but a spotted lanternfly is one of our kind of latest concerns on the invasive species end. And they had one that showed up in a 4-H entomology project at the Kansas State Fair. Again, the student had no idea had it properly identified, but had no idea it was invasive species. And it led to kind of a lot of concern. So again, so important for just even normal people, I shouldn't say normal people, everyday people to understand and be able to identify invasive species, because that can help us catch things before they get out of control. So what is an invasive plant? An invasive species is defined as a species that is non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration that we're looking at, and one whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Invasive species can be plants, animals, other organisms, and human actions are generally our primary means of an invasive species introduction. There are some cases of what we might consider invasive species that have introduced themselves. So here in Missouri, armadillos and black vultures are two species that they are native to North America, but they have kind of on their own actions, they've kind of introduced themselves to our state and our environment, our ecosystem, and they do cause harm to our environment. So we might deem them an invasive species under this. So, and most things that get introduced are not always, they don't always have the capability of becoming an invasive. So like I always think of things that like we put out hibiscus plants, and they do great in our summer, but they cannot hold up to our winter. So they have no potential to become an invasive plant unless down the road with climate change and adaptation, they might have that capability, but that's probably hundreds, if not thousands of years down the road. So that's a plant, you know, it does not have the ability to become invasive. Most of our invasives already come from an environment that's similar to what we have here. So that's one of the things that makes them successful. Why do we care? So from an economic perspective, invasive species cost about $120 billion a year for the whole US. Recreation, invasive plants can hinder or destroy recreational activities such as hunting, hiking, and or boating. So they can, you know, alter environments that we recreate on, making it not as enjoyable for our recreational purposes. Food security, invasive plants can invade agronomic crops and reduce yields. And so this overall can affect our food supply and the cost of our food. So if we have to fight invasive plants to have successful crops, this can, again, kind of affect food security. And then from an ecological perspective, which is usually the one that I come from, is invasive plants can limit and reduce our biodiversity. And this can accelerate the decline and extinction of native plants and animal species. So most of the time, from an ecological perspective, if something is an introduced or invasive species, it's not going to appeal to our native insects or animals, and they're not going to make any use of it. So even though it might look like there's plenty of greenery for caterpillars to eat, if it's all invasive, sericea or honeysuckle, those caterpillars, they aren't going to eat it and they're going to starve. So from that ecological perspective, invasives can really mess up our food chains. So I'm going to jump right in to these kind of common and easy ones to identify. The first one's autumn olive, and this map is from EdMaps, which probably doesn't do it justice for how far spread this plant has made itself in Missouri. Probably covers most, you can probably find this in most counties in Missouri. And it is it's non-leguminous, which means that it doesn't, it's not in the legume family, but it does have the ability to fix nitrogen. And so in some of our areas, we don't have a lot of nitrogen, and the plants that grow there are adapted to growing in low nitrogen soils. And so this can actually change the soil chemical makeup, which can make it not as appealing to our native plants that would grow there. It also is very aggressive and competitive. And so by changing those nitrogen amounts in the soil, this makes it kind of, again, gets rid of some of its competition so it can take over. This tends to put off, so it's very prolific. It can root sprout and spreads kind of that way. It forms a lot of thickets because of this, but it also has, as you can see on this picture up here, it creates hundreds and hundreds of berries per plant each year. And these are quite appealing to wildlife. So birds will will spread this. This is one that falls under, so I always hear like, oh, but if it's good for wildlife, if they like to eat it, then why is it such a problem? Well, one, it does take over and it reduces biodiversity, but also these berries are kind of similar to honeysuckle berries in that they do not have a lot of nutrition for birds. And so it's kind of like them popping M&Ms instead of eating something that has a lot of nutritional value that'll help them prepare for winter, for example, or make it through the winter. So it is a food source, but it's not a great one for them. So again, tardily deciduous, which is a fancy way of saying that it's going to hold its leaves quite a bit longer than some of our other native shrubs and understory trees, which helps make it identifiable in the fall. So if we are going through the forest and we come across a similar shrub and it still has its leaves on come like November, this is a good indication that it is autumn olive. It also has these very silvery leaves to it, and they are somewhat thorny if you look closely at them. And then all those red berries will be also present in fall. One of the things about invasive species is this one in particular, it came from an area that has a slightly longer growing season, which is why it retains its leaves longer into the fall than our natives. So it is, not quite adapted to lose its leaves at the same time as what we do. But this is great for management efforts because it's a good time to come through and treat them. Same thing happens in the spring. So many of our invasive species make themselves known and they get the edge on our natives because they do leaf out earlier. But this is great for us because that also means we can identify them and treat them before our natives leaf out, which is a good thing because then we're not harming our natives with the treatments that we use for the invasives. And management of this one, so it does have fairly deep root systems. And so if you want to mechanically remove it, this may require some heavy machinery. Cutting it, which is another kind of mechanical application, it is not going to be very successful because this one's again a prolific root sprouter. So cutting it may push it back just a little, but it's going to sprout again from those. It already has that developed root system, so it's going to come right back. Prescribed fire has been shown to have very little impact on autumn olive. And so kind of for this one, best treatment is chemical treatment. And you can do this a couple different ways. So foliar treatment is where you're going to try and cover all of the leaves with herbicide. In this case, it's usually a glyphosate that's recommended. This again is something that if you do in fall, if all the natives have dropped their leaves, you're not as likely to hit them with it. It can be tricky depending on the size of your autumn olive plants because they can get pretty tall and above our head. Another way is to do a basal bark treatment. So this is a triclopyr ester that gets mixed with a basil oil at a 20 to 30% rate. And we put this on the lowest 15 inches of the stem and it gets absorbed by the bark and that will kill back the autumn olive. And then cut stump, which is usually probably the most utilized, is a glyphosate at a 25 to 50% volume with water or triclopyramine in water or ester oil. And essentially you're just going to cut those stems off and come back and treat them with that glyphosate or triclopyr, and that'll prevent the stump sprouting and actually kill the tree itself. Next one are the bush honeysuckles. These again, pretty much found in every county in Missouri. And it is going to shade out a lot of our native wildflowers and our young native trees. They are, again, grow very thick. If you've ever seen a forest that's had an understory taken over by these guys, they're about the only plant you see once they start to take over. And this is because they secrete a chemical into the soil, and this will hinder native trees from growing. And again, so that reduces our biodiversity a great deal. But also they've found that birds that generally use understory species, shrubs, or small trees, when there's no other options, those same birds will use bush honeysuckle, and they hire suffer a lot higher nest predation because they're closer to the ground, and the branches of this are just not quite as sturdy. So this generally forms as a large upright spreading shrub, can reach heights up to 15 to 20 feet. Flowers are pretty much gone now, and we're seeing like the red berries on this one. It does have opposite leaves, and the flowers are usually fragrant. So there's some myths like that non-native bush honeysuckle doesn't smell nice. It does. It smells just as pleasant. It came from or was introduced because of being used in gardens and landscaping. So it is just as fragrant as what we would have planted in our garden. It does green up a lot earlier than our surrounding native vegetation. So this one will usually put leaves on early March. We'll start to see it greening up. And then it also will keep its leaves much later. So I have pictures near in Phelps County near Interstate 44 of a whole hill of honeysuckle that still have green leaves Thanksgiving week. So they do hold on to those green leaves a little bit, well, quite a bit longer than our native, which is again really good for identification and for treatment. So again, just to kind of look at what it does to understories and how prolific it can be. A look at those flowers. So they can change from white or pink to a yellowish color as they age. And we're pretty much past flowering season for them and into berry season. So you see these bright red berries, usually September to October. And again, these kind of have the same, are pretty much the same as autumn olive berries in that they taste great to birds, but they don't provide a lot of nutritional value to them. They're not very high in protein, but unfortunately being so tempting to birds allows them to be spread. So the seeds get spread kind of near and far because of birds consuming it, and then those seeds coming out with their scat. A management for this one. So the root systems are shallow. So if you can catch this one early, you can pull those younger plants from the ground. You can use a grubbing tool to help pull larger plants. If you do pull like this time of year and they have berries present, you want to make sure that you discard of those plants in like a trash bag. So all of those seeds are going to be contained. You wouldn't want to mulch it because you don't want to spread it to your mulch pile. This one, prescribed fire, will kill the seedlings, but generally not our larger plants. Like they're got a strong enough bark that they can resist prescribed, or I shouldn't say resist, but they can survive a prescribed fire. So this is another one that if it's gotten too large for you to pull it out, that a chemical treatment may be your best option. And it's pretty similar to autumn olive. You can do a foliar spray, which again, if you've caught it while it's a little bit smaller, this might work. This also is good for you to do in the fall or early spring after the natives have lost their leaves, and you can treat just the leaves of the honeysuckle. You can also treat this one with a basil bark oil. And so that's pretty a nice, easy way. The hardest part for that one is that honeysuckle tends to put up lots and lots of stems. And so it can be time consuming to treat those individual stems with the basil bark treatment. Same can be said for the cut stump method, but since you're not trying to make sure you get a coat all the way around on the cut stump, you're kind of going over the top of them. It is a little bit simpler. So, and glyphosate is your best chemical for this one, so most effective. You can use triclopyr and you can use Tordon on it, but glyphosate is probably the safest and most reasonable one to use on it. Calorie pear or Bradford pear. This one was actually kind of interestingly in the news this past week. So it's there's a calorie pear that actually I guess grew in the area of the Twin Towers after 9/11, and it has done really well, and they've kind of taken that calorie pear as a symbol of hope and growth after that tragedy. Unfortunately, it is considered an invasive species. That's probably one of the reasons it did so well in that area. But so it was interesting that this was in the news this week. This is when the original Calais pears or Bradford pear varieties that were sold at landscaping places. They were sterile, so they wouldn't be able to reproduce or to potentially spread. They were experimented with in the early 1950s as a potential grafting tree for other pear trees that produce fruits. And then with the pretty white flowers and kind of the canopy shape, they were developed into landscaping trees. And with so many varieties of this one, it turned out that they were no longer sterile and they could cross-pollinate and reproduce that way. They can also vegetatively produce. So this means that they can put off a root and then a root sprout comes up. So this creates fairly dense thickets when left to their own devices. And these can be seen across St. Louis is a particular area that I've seen a lot of Calais pear thickets, kind of even close to the highway. And so probably birds probably spread them there, or they were used as a landscaping tree in that area. And then they form kind of these dense thickets like you see here. They will outcompete, so native trees in particular, they again produce leaves earlier than our native trees, and they will keep their leaves a little bit later than our native trees as well. Downfall to this is that they shade out a lot of our spring wildflowers. So our spring wildflowers are kind of adapted to our deciduous trees. So they get a little bit of extra, they get a little bit more sunlight through March and April when our trees start to leaf out. But Bradford pear will shade those out because they do put their leaves out that much earlier. A small, medium-sized tree usually. So here's one that's been put in landscaping. These are still sold at many nurseries as a landscaping tree. Again, they found a lot in urban areas. This is a 270 Highway 6440 in St. Louis interchange. So it's definitely escaped in this area, so it's spreading pretty fast. They do grow best in full sun. So again, these kind of areas that are open like this, or kind of on the I can't think of the word we use for it. The areas that like this generally is mowed grass, or an area that's kind of left to its own devices. No trees have been planted here prior to this, and so it takes advantage of that. Twigs are thornless in cultivated trees, but in wild trees, so trees that have cross-pollinated and seeded, and then that seed was planted and developed, we do see thorns on the ends of those twigs. Leaves are alternate, simple, and generally oval. Some cultivars develop patterns of colored circles and spots in autumn. It is fairly attractive in the fall as far as colors that it has. It also has kind of this interesting petiole so that the leaves will bob in the wind. It does flower early in the spring. The flowers are pretty attractive, but they smell terrible. Kind of has the smell of rotten fish to it. And because of this, it attracts a lot of fly pollinators to it. So it generally has a lot of flies surrounding it during that time. It does produce fruits or pears. They do not get very large. So usually about a half an inch to an inch in diameter. They are green. They kind of look like a small pear in color and not quite in shape as like our traditional pear. Nothing that's here really eats the fruits at this stage, but after we've had several frosts and these have started to darken and wrinkle, then they will be palatable to birds. Treatment for Bradford pear, foliar, again, if you catch it early, if you have it spreading, you can do a foliage spray. Again, or if it's small, you can do a basal bark treatment. Best is usually a cut stump. So cutting it down and then applying a glyphosate or triclopyr mixture. There is, if you are in the right area in the spring, I have seen some calorie pear kind of buyback programs. So if you bring in proof that you've cut down a Bradford pear, they'll give you a native tree to replace it with. So something to keep an eye out for in the spring. Multiflora rose is my next one. So these guys, they can go from a small to a large infestation pretty quickly. They do have some climbing capabilities. So just like a rose bush, they kind of have these arching canes, climbing canes, and they will spread out very quickly and root sprout from and kind of form, again, sort of a dense thicket, but it's really not like a tree shape because they have multiple canes that come out of there. They were introduced as a form of a living fence. So the idea was that you would plant these where you wanted a fence line, and this would keep livestock in. Fortunately, they easily escaped and kind of spread into areas we don't want them to be in. And because of that, they're on our invasive species list. So again, they can climb up trees, shade out a lot of our native understory. They can be very painful to deal with. So it's a very thorny species. Kind of forms these dense clumps in the understory. They do have a pinnately compound leaf. And rose hips. So this is one of the ways that I identify them come late fall and winter if I'm trying to get rid of them during kind of it's always a lot more pleasant to treat things in the woods when we're kind of in the winter when things are more open. So those rose hips can help with the identification. Again, kind of these long arching or climbing branches. They're covered with generally with thorns. Keep showing you pictures. These clusters of flowers, again, we usually see those in April to June, but this is also indicative of multiflora, these clumps of flowers. We do have a native rose called Carolina rose, and it generally has single flowers, and they're generally pink in color. So that kind of helps distinguish from multiflora. They also generally have like just one or two canes, kind of a very small in size, whereas multiflora tends to form these really large kind of mounds of rose bush. And here's those red rose hips. So this usually, they'll start to develop in July when the flowers start to fall off and not be as recognizable, and they'll turn into these red rose hips. So this is a good way of finding these guys in the off season. Mechanically, chainsaws can be used for large stands. I recommend that you proceed with caution because it can be impractical because of kind of the large brushiness of their nature that they have, plus the thorns. It can be difficult to deal with them. They do root sprouts, so you'd have to not only cut them with the chainsaw, but also work to remove those plants' root systems from the environment to control them completely. We found that prescribed fire will kill stems and will kill seedlings, but older plants, if it's not a very hot fire, which most of our prescribed fire, we like to keep it kind of low and slow as our usual prescription. We don't want it to get very hot because of other species and trees that it can damage. So we generally end up with some older plants that re-sprout from the roots. But prescribed fire can be used as part of like an integrated plan. So this might, so we can run prescribed fire, kind of kill back the plants, and then this makes it easier to come back in with herbicides. Or perhaps a mechanical treatment after we've kind of beat it back with prescribed fire. Glyphosate and triclopyr also work on this one pretty well. You can do any of those 3 methods we've talked about previously. I won't bore you with the details. This is one that foliar treatment may be a better treatment option because of, again, trying to get in there to cut those stumps and then treat them with the glyphosate can be very difficult. So if you catch them, like usually, again, late October, early November, they'll still have leaves on them and you can do a foliar treatment. And it's a little bit easier as far as not having to get in with the thorns. Tree of Heaven. This is one that is not a new invasive species by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one that it's kind of been under the radar for a while, at least in Missouri. We haven't talked about it a lot, but it's a tree that was planted, kind of started in urban tree plantings and has kind of stretched from there. It can grow very fast, which is one of the reasons that it was popular in some of our urban settings, because we could get shade from it very quickly. But they now know that perhaps wasn't a good idea as far as because it has these invasive tendencies and can kind of escape from where we put it. It starts out with very smooth green bark, and then will kind of, as it ages, look like this. So it kind of looks like cantaloupe skin. It has a very long pinnately compound leaf. So they can be anywhere from 1 to 4 feet long. So again, this sometimes kind of resembles a pecan or a walnut leaf, but it is much longer. So this is a yardstick, and so you can see how long that leaf is. They also are completely smooth, except for these notches that you see here. Those are called glandular teeth. And if you crush this one up, so if you crush up the leaves, it is pretty strong smelling. And the closest description I can give you to this is that it smells kind of like rotten peanut butter or rancid peanut butter. So it does not smell pleasant at all. Another plant that it's sometimes mistaken for is sumac. So, and if you crush up sumac, it has a more fragrant smell to it, where this one just smells bad. The twigs are pretty stout, and if you were to cut them open, you can see, so again, kind of going back, looks like almost peanut butter as the pith. It also has very large, so as you can imagine, it has those great big leaves. It produces really large leaf scars. The twigs are pretty easily broken, so you can expose that spongy brown pith. Seeds, so it has a seed that's a samara. It looks a little bit like a maple, and they are on the trees right now. I am plagued right across from my daughter's school. There's a house that has a ginormous tree of heaven in their front yard, so I get to see it every day, and it is covered in samaras right now. This one looks long, and that's because management of tree of heaven is pretty complicated. So they're very prolific root sprouters, and it can be very hard to manage them because of this. So mechanically removing it, if we do not treat with an herbicide, it will come back over and over and over again. So it responds quite readily to being removed. And it is necessary to remove potentially hazardous trees. It's best to treat with an herbicide first, allow 30 days for it to take effect, and then cut it. Hand pulling of young seedlings, if you can catch them and recognize what they are, it is effective as long as we get the whole root system. Even small root fragments are capable of producing new shoots. And seedlings can be confused with root suckers, which are, so if we have one tree of heaven, we usually have multiple because of those root suckers. Chemical treatment, again, foliar, we have to be able to reach all of it. So foliar application is not always possible. particularly if it's reached large size, which it grows very fast. So it reaches those size pretty well. Basil bark, if you can catch it again when it's less than 6 inches, this works really well. And this is one that I recommend treating with Tordon. So Tordon has its downfall is that it has a lot of transfer or translocation to other roots of the same species. So if you can treat this one, if you have like a dense thicket of them, you can treat them with that, and they actually are going to spread that herbicide root system to root system, which in this case, usually that's a hindrance, but in this case, that's actually a benefit. And we can do that in mid to late summer. So well-established tree of heaven sands are only eliminated through repeated efforts in monitoring. Our initial treatments oftentimes just reduce the root systems, and it is important that we follow up with them to make sure that we remove them completely, and persistence is the key. As you can see on that one picture, there were a lot of samaras there. So these guys spread pretty readily from seed sources like that. And it can be just difficult to remove. I will say that there is a lot of importance here. This tree of heaven has been noted as a tree, as a host tree for the invasive spotted lanternfly. So managing these may help us keep that spotted lanternfly at bay. Those are kind of the overview today. I'm running out of time as well, but chemical disclaimer, always read and follow label instructions. So you want to make sure that you wear your PPE, you mix it at the rates that are recommended, and you apply it in the way that they tell you to on those label instructions. Additionally, if you're chemically treating plants over, in, or near water, make sure that you use herbicides labeled for use in aquatic systems. So today's kind of chemical that was probably most recommended is glyphosate. The well-known trade name for that is Roundup, and there's definitely aquatic system labeled herbicide glyphosates that are out there at the farm stores. So that one is pretty common to find in aquatic ready mixture if you're close to those water sources. Glyphosate again is recommended because one, it's pretty cheap from a monetary perspective. It's readily available, and I know that chemical treatment is not everybody's favorite because of all the concerns with it. Glyphosate has a really fast breakdown time, so that's why it's also recommended so often, is that it can be applied and it breaks down very fast, so it loses its toxicity quickly in the environment, so it's gone pretty fast. So that's kind of why we have that one a lot of times on our list. If you're looking for more resources for managing or identifying invasive species, Missouri has a Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force, moinvasives.org, and they have, again, quite a few resources and links to other resources for identification. There's also a Midwest Invasive Species Information Network. That one includes not only plants, but also insects, wildlife, and how to manage those. The UGA Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health also has a website, invasive.org, and they have resources for identification and management. And then Missouri Department of Conservation has an invasive species field guide, and this gives a lot of information, and this is where a lot of the management practices are taken from, is from the MDC field guide and the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force guides. And those, again, there's usually more than one way to treat them, and so there's lots of options out there. And then just very quickly, so these have been in the media quite a bit lately. MDC put out a press release not too many days ago about people being on the lookout for Asian longhorned beetle. So this is an invasive species that's not been found in Missouri, but it has been in the US for a significant amount of time. They recently had some populations found in South Carolina. It's also been found out west, but it is a fairly large beetle, and it lays eggs, and then the larvae, so very similar to emerald ash borer, these larvae feed on the cambial layer of the trees, which can lead to tree mortality. And so again, just kind of one that they've been asking landowners to be on the lookout for. Nothing's been confirmed in Missouri as far as I know this year. But again, just on the lookout. Another one that is pretty well known and has been in the US for quite some time, but again, we've had very limited numbers found in Missouri, and most of the time they've been found near areas where perhaps a camper or a tourist has brought it in on their car and they've not established themselves. So it's just been found that probably one or two rode here. This is the caterpillar for gypsy moth. And you've probably seen, we monitor for gypsy moth pretty heavily. So MDC and USDA have kind of a joint program where they put out those red triangle kind of boxes that hang in trees, and those have gypsy moth pheromone in them. And so if there are populations close by, they would find those in those traps, and this helps us monitor across the state. This one, we believe that perhaps it's not moved as fast as we thought it might originally, because male moths are the only ones that can fly. So when this caterpillar, if it's a female, goes through its metamorphosis into a moth, it is actually a non-flying moth. So it makes it a little bit harder for it to spread. The last one is the one I kind of mentioned earlier, the spotted lanternfly. And this is actually not a fly or a moth, it's actually a leafhopper. And these are kind of these are the three life stages of it. A very showy insect, so it's actually very pretty, but it can be very detrimental, and will, if it makes it to Missouri, will be probably pretty detrimental to our forests and to vineyards. So it actually has really adverse effects on vineyards. That's one of grapes, or another one of its host plants that we'll use. And it, I should have put a picture in here. There's pictures. So this one has been confirmed in much of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia. So kind of in the East Coast is where this one has shown up, and they have some pretty strict quarantine practices in place in an effort to keep it in those areas. But this one, you will find, if you find one, you'll find hundreds of lanternflies, and they will like coat the stem of a tree with their secretions, and it interferes with kind of all their chemical processes and physiological processes, which will lead to killing of the tree. So again, it could be very devastating, and so we just want to be on the lookout for it. Like I said earlier, it was in the news earlier that a 4-H student had one of his entomology display at the state fair. They did a lot of quarantining to make sure that nothing was moved, and then tried to locate. So the belief is that perhaps it rode on a camper or a vehicle. They have been known to lay their eggs on metal. So they found egg clusters on like the metal frames of cars. And so again, just a lot of concern about it moving that way. So just kind of three insects to be in the know about. It does, again, it was great that entomology judge actually knew what they were looking at, so they could, kind of track things down pretty quick. We also, and I just saw it today, there was an invasive aquatic plant, and I won't be able to remember the name now that I'm thinking about it, that was found down in the boot heel of Missouri. So again, kind of always coming up and always keeping our eye out on new things. I'll stop sharing. Any questions today?
Sarah, I had one. What does glyphosate do to if it gets into your pond?
So if you use the aquatic approved glyphosate, it shouldn't have any effect on your pond.
What if you get the non-aquatic approved?
So the concern is that it will have adverse effects on your like frogs and other amphibian species and fish. So that's the big concern with it. You may also see, so glyphosate's kind of what we call a broad acting herbicide. And so you may also see that it does affect your aquatic plants. With the aquatic approved, it has less reaction because of the dilution factor when you water. So it's not going to have as much of an adverse effect on the aquatic plants. But the big one is that we're concerned about aquatic organisms. So, and even if, you know, we definitely say you should use the aquatic approved glyphosate. It does still, even if it's the non-aquatic, it has a really quick breakdown time. So you would not, you would see adverse reactions from it very quickly. Any other questions? So I think I will always talk about invasive species in the spring and in the fall, because those are two good times for us to work, particularly on plants. We do have a lot of other non-plant invasive species, but where landowners can probably make the biggest difference in, you know, making healthy forests and good wildlife habitat is if they can fight invasive species on their properties, because it does really hinder some of our other organisms and our native plant species. No questions today? All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up then. Next week, same time, same place, we are going to talk about management plans, what all is in a management plan, who writes management plans, where you would find resources if you want a management plan for your property. And Amanda, if you're on next week, you have a management plan, don't you?
Yes, I do.
So I might, if you're on next week, I might call on you to talk about your management plan.
Okay.
And if you're not here, that's okay too.
I will have to study up on it and make sure I know all the details.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I will let you get on with your day. Happy Wednesday. And I will talk to you guys next week.